Hi, hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming and good evening. My name's Sarah Hill. I'm one of the directors of Opus Independence, the social enterprise behind the Festival of Debate. Do drop a line in the chat if you have any issues hearing or anything like that, and I will be on hand to attempt to operate some technical support. The festival programme runs from the 22nd of April to the 30th of May, and this year includes over 65 events, 140 speakers, and 50 community partner organisations. The festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic, and political crises we collectively face. There are no easy answers. But we hope the festival creates a space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of our events are free at the point of access, and where we do need to charge, we keep ticket prices as low as we can. If you'd like to make a donation to the festival to keep us able to do this, you can do so by visiting our website at festivalofdebate.com. We want to tell new kinds of stories about the societal changes and big opportunities for positive change that we're seeing through these events and the last 10 years of the festival, which has been a wild decade. You will get an email asking for your feedback after this event, and please fill it in if you can, because it will help us understand your perspectives and your part in those positive changes. But once again, thank you for being here so much tonight. I'm very pleased to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and their microphones and say hello to our wonderful attendees. And I will hand over to Granville Williams for the rest of the evening. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'd like to welcome you to this event. My name is Granville Williams, and I edit Media North, which is putting on this event in partnership with the Festival of Debate. You can get Media North if you go to the website. It's online at medianorth.outlook.com. But just as an introduction, a background to give some context to tonight's meeting, Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, gave evidence to a Work and Pension Committee in April. They visited Manchester. And in this session, he called for an end to the punitive approach to benefit cuts, which he believed is designed to, quote, please certain newspapers rather than get people back into jobs. He talked about an initiative that he was running in Manchester, which was called Live Well. And he said, what are the lessons he could draw from the successful initiative? And he said, you can't order people's recovery from the top down. You can't batter them with sanctions towards work. And I think those are some key points. Now, we're in a situation where there's now, I think, a fantastic, powerful backlash against the government's proposals. I mean, Ros Jones, who was narrowly re-elected as the Doncaster's Labour mayor, said that voters were angry at a number of the government's decisions, including winter fuel payments, but also the slashing of disability benefits. And she said, quote, I think national governments need to look and see what people are saying. And finally, now in the last day or two, a number of MPs, Labour MPs, have gone very publicly criticising the way in which the Labour government's priorities seem to be not to tackle the wealthy in terms of an alternative, but rather to cut public spending and cut money from the people who can least afford it. So that's the context to this evening's session. So welcome to you all. Thanks for supporting us and coming along. I'm going to hand over now to Rachel. Rachel Brodie is a senior lecturer, Dr. Rachel Brodie, is the senior lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. But I think it's better if I let you, Rachel, give a plug for yourself and what you do. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Granville. So yeah, I am a senior lecturer in media, culture, communication at Liverpool John Moores, but I have many decades experience as a journalist. So what I want to do today, and I'm going to let you know, I am relying a little bit on notes because a mixture of menopause and insomnia has fried my brain today. I'll try not to read for them too much, but I will be relying on them a little bit. But yeah, so I want to talk to you about the work I'm doing in the National Union of Journalists. So it's with media workers to try and challenge how poverty is reported. And I hope, giving you this sort of brief information will open up some space for comments and questions. And as Granville just said, we know that the British media has, particularly in recent years, but it's not new by any stretch of the imagination, demonised people in poverty. With a more recent focus shifting to people in receipt of disability benefits for the reasons that have just been pointed out, because it serves to justify some of the brutal cuts that we're seeing. So it's persistent and it is intentional, and it's clearly a way to justify these cruelest of cuts. But within the NUJ then, where there's a campaign called Reporting Poverty, and it seeks to challenge how poverty is reported. And we know that the Daily Mail isn't going to change its political position on the basis of these conversations, but it can open up discussion or force a discussion, and it can have an impact more widely. And it's important to note as well, I think, that people in need of disability benefits aren't necessarily experiencing poverty. But with the PIP cuts likely to plunge 300,000 people into poverty, the connections, I think, are clear. And the recognition of the reporting being used to justify those cuts is absolutely necessary. And we also, again, as Granville pointed out, there is support and opposition to the Labour and support for people in receipt of benefits currently. And it is a powerful opposition. And I think in many ways that's changed the way in which journalism is now reporting on this. We're not necessarily seeing that language of skivers and scroungers that we used to. But that doesn't mean it's gone away. So The Sun just 2 days ago reported what at first glance could appear to be a fairly positive article about benefits entitlement and entitlement to PIP. But it used words like freebies and free cash and discounts, almost like it's some sort of loyalty card. So the stigmatizing, I think, is more subtle, but it's still there. And the more recent focus on the reporting of benefit cheats as well, who claim to be disabled, is a problem within journalism. What the government calls the biggest fraud crackdown in a generation is supported by a backdrop of headlines like OAP jailed for benefit fraud. That's the Scottish Sun. OAP fraudsters claim thousands. That's from the Daily Record. PIP benefit fraud to be targeted in DWP crackdown. That's from Bristol Live. So these papers, they're across the nation. And this sort of journalism relies on sensationalism, obviously, and on stereotypes, clearly. But importantly, it ignores that PIP fraud specifically is a non-issue in terms of the numbers of recorded cases, which, as I understand it, is 0. So within the NUJ then, the National Union of Journalists, the journalism, the Media Workers Union, there's this ongoing campaign. And I started it a decade ago while I was unemployed and I was in receipt of job seekers allowance and housing benefit. And I'd previously worked on national newspapers and magazines. So it gave my understanding of the industry and my trade union activism sort of combined to give me a unique insight into the potential to challenge the reporting. And at the time also a really good focus for my fury. And today the NUJ has about 25,000 members. And there are rules for those members, which some of you might find surprising. We'll see. They include statements that a journalist strives to ensure that information disseminated is honestly conveyed, accurate and fair, and that a journalist does her or his utmost to correct harmful inaccuracies and differentiates between fact and opinion. So you can see the challenge faced in the wider industry and within the NUJ with this campaign. Those are, the NUJ's code of conduct, the NUJ's rules, which aren't necessarily adhered to. So to get this campaign going, I first worked with an organisation called Church Action on Poverty in Salford. And together we created the very first guide to reporting poverty. And the content, and this is important, I think, and it was important, it's remained important throughout the campaign. The content of that guide and the wording was shaped entirely by people with direct lived experience of poverty. And comments contributors shared include: don't assume poverty is due to people's choices, recognise the national and global economic situation. Judging people who claim benefits as lazy is unfair and inaccurate. Full-time workers need financial help too. Reporting should emphasise that people who work have to receive benefits to make ends meet, and that this is in a wealthy country. And as I was listening, we were in the Lake District for a day. And my intention wasn't to produce a guide from this. I was just listening to people talk. And I recognised that these people in receipt of benefits, while simultaneously the target of sensationalising, stereotyping and scapegoating in the media, were in fact overlooked experts on the topic. Not only did they understand how to discuss poverty and the benefit system, they also clearly understood how they were being targeted by the media. And so as I was driving home, I thought, we don't just need an article about this. We need to tell journalists how to do it better. So this first guide was produced. And there was a second guide more recently, produced in collaboration again with Church Action on Poverty. And this time it included Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And that guide's called Reporting Poverty, a Guide for Media Professionals. And again, this saw contributors who'd experienced poverty, but they worked alongside journalists in focus groups over a period of months. And there were contributions from the BBC, Channel 4, Yorkshire Post, The Eye, The Mirror, and even The Sun. My own research, though, has returned a little bit to that first guide and to developing the idea of people in poverty as expert sources. And it's not a fanciful idea. It's one that recognises journalists don't have that knowledge. The industry is predominantly and increasingly middle class. And this stigmatising isn't just conscious, it can also be unintentional too. So we get journalists pretending to live on benefits for a week rather than interviewing somebody who is in receipt of benefits to tap into their knowledge and their understanding. And we get journalists who often relying on sources who don't have the knowledge of navigating benefit claims or surviving on benefits or understanding sanctions or the necessity of PIP or how difficult it can be to claim benefits or how expensive it can be to be poor. So my argument is that by recognising the knowledge of people in receipt of benefits and of people in poverty, we can start potentially to undo some of this stigmatising and dehumanising that's out there, however subtle it may be. So I'm glad that the NUJ just last month supported a motion at its most recent delegate meeting to ratify guidelines for members which acknowledge that the NUJ believes, firstly, members can't avoid a measure of responsibility in fighting stigmatisation of the working poor and benefit recipients. So it's making sure members, journalists, media workers are aware of their responsibility when writing about this topic. Print, broadcast and online media should not originate material which contributes to socio-economic discrimination. And recognising those in poverty can be experts on the topic could influence and improve media discourse in meeting these aims now set out by the National Union of Journalists. So I think that gives you sort of a broad idea of what it is, the campaign that's taking place in the NUJ. I'm happy to talk a bit more about it if you've got any questions, and also, you know, my hope from what it might do. I'm hoping it informs journalists on how best to report on the topic, and also get them to stop and think about what it is that they're producing and they're contributing to when they're writing about poverty. Sorry. And I'm going to pop some resources into the chat for you. So we have both those guides and some other resources that might be of value. And that is my little bit done. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. That's really good. That's got us off to a great start there, Rachel. I'm going to hand over to James Morrison. James is an associate professor at Strathclyde University. And I got in touch with James because I read the book Scroungers, which I think gives you an excellent background on a previous period. But I'm going to hand over to James first to introduce himself and then to talk a little bit about another aspect about the media and the discourse on disability in terms of social media. But over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Granville. Yeah, just a tiny correction. I'm really sorry. I'm not at Strathclyde. I'm at the University of Stirling. But don't worry at all. You know that because we've been corresponding for ages anyway. So I know you know that, Granville. No offence taken. Don't worry. But yes, I'm an associate professor in journalism studies at Stirling University. Like Rachel, I'm also a former journalist. Although once a journalist, always a journalist. So although we're both very critical of a lot of the so-called journalism that's out there, I think both of us do at least partly professionally identify as journalists as well as academics. And I'm also a long-time member of the NUJ myself. Again, like Rachel, I've spent a number of years publishing research focusing on media and political narratives around people experiencing poverty and economic disadvantage, including historically. Which is part of what I was looking at in the book Scroungers a few years ago, which the particular present day scenario I was focusing on was the sort of very much the discourse of strivers and skivers and shirkers and scroungers under the coalition government. But I also tried to look at the evolution of those kinds of narratives of the deserving versus the undeserving poor and so forth through history. My own focus has also tended to be on representations when in looking at discourses and narratives around poverty and the benefit system. I particularly put an emphasis on representations of people receiving out of work benefits of one kind or another, especially working age people who are not in paid work but are claiming support, whether because of long-term unemployment or so-called economic inactivity, which of course is the big debate, the big hot potato political issue of the moment, which is leading us all together tonight. My most recent research focuses more directly on engaging with people with lived experience of so-called economic inactivity themselves. So I'm focusing increasingly on not just analysing the narratives themselves, the media, the political rhetoric, the media narratives, but exploring the disconnect between those narratives and the lived realities of people who are actually in these situations, i.e. out of conventional paid work due to long-term unemployment, disability, physical or mental or ill health, caring responsibilities, or combinations of a multitude of those factors. For the book I'm currently writing, I've interviewed a large number of individuals who would be classified as economically inactive by the government and the Office for National Statistics. But what's really struck me is that despite being classified as economically inactive and in the eyes of the tabloids, no doubt, workless, many of them never seem to stop working. So the book's become about questioning, if not challenging, these stereotypes and the stigmatizing language around so-called inactive people by exploring the very active contributions many of these people are actually making, as well as the value, both social and economic, of these contributions. Many of the people I've spoken to are not only managing their own complex disabilities and long-term health conditions, but they're also providing unpaid care for others, often working very long hours and saving, by the way, the taxpayer and the state huge amounts of money. And we don't hear nearly enough about that. We only ever hear about the financial pounds and pence cost of the welfare state, rather than the huge contributions many of those who are forced through no fault of their own to rely to some extent on it are actually making. Some also work as volunteers, often in areas that are helping to plug holes in the social safety net, in the social security system, but also the social care system. Volunteering in food banks, offering peer support to other disadvantaged people. And I think Rachel gave an illustration of something quite similar from the pandemic a little while ago. Almost all of them are united by having very low incomes. So they don't have the luxury of being able to save or invest they have no choice but to spend every penny they have, to the extent they have any money. So even in that narrowest of senses, as consumers in their local economies, they're very economically active. And the other key strand of my recent and current ongoing research, just to touch on it briefly, alongside looking at these discourses and the disconnect between the discourses and the lived experiences of economic inactivity, is that I've been looking in detail at how on social media, as Granville rightly says, but also on comment posts published beneath articles that are published online, some of the vitriolic and sort of demonizing comments that we get from people posting on the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or other papers of that kind in response to some of these articles are not only negative but are so vicious that I would argue they are bordering on hate speech. And one of the arguments I'm sort of starting to develop on the back of some of that data I've been examining recently, particularly in response to articles focusing on the current economic inactivity debate, is that for economic disadvantage or someone's socioeconomic status being added to the list of protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010. And in fact, I would argue that if that grouping were already on the list of protected groups, some of what I've observed online, particularly posted and unmoderated, left published on these sites because it's not being challenged by other readers and therefore flagged up to the moderators, and the moderators on those sites are not proactively enough doing their jobs. Some of what is remaining posted there, where people, for example, at times are likened to vermin, and the most extreme comments are posted, by any definition would amount to hate speech, and would potentially, if their targets were identifiable in some way, be actionable under the law if socioeconomic status was another protected grouping. So that's another strand of research that sort of spun out of my ongoing interest, sort of weird in, but obviously in a very critical way, in the sort of disturbing continuum of negative discourses we've had through time around people living in poverty, and particularly people who need to rely on the support of others to some extent. Thanks very much, Granville, for giving me this chance.
Thanks, James. Apologies, sincere apologies for getting the university wrong. Both good universities, but yes, Stirling, yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Now, can I encourage people to send in questions, please? I see that there's some in already, but what I'm going to do is just spend a few minutes now with James and Rachel, just firing some questions at them, and see whether we can begin to give some more deeper context to it. I'd like to start off actually with the policy proposals, because it's now several months now since we've had often leaks, drip feed, all sorts of things in the papers, until March, when we got a more definitive statement. So maybe either Rachel or James, what do you think, how have those been reported? What are the things that have, if you want, from the point of view of the government, seem to massage what is actually a very devastating package? Because when we look at it, the figure is that bandied about is 5 billion. But today I saw in a post from Andy MacDonald, the MP up from the Northeast, that he put it at 7 billion. So I wondered if either of you wanted to come in on how that package of proposals has been presented, and what are the key things that we should be looking at and focusing on. Anybody, either of you, want to come in on that first?
I'm smiling at James. Do you want to go?
Do you want me to go? Yeah, I mean, obviously I've been looking very closely at this because it's the sort of rationale and the justification for it all the way through has been to tackle this burgeoning economic inactivity bill, so to speak, hasn't it? A huge number. Maybe we can come to this later. A huge number of the endlessly repeated, supposedly factual statements about the actual scale of economic inactivity are massively exaggerated. And there's a lot of things that are repeated about it every day, right across the political spectrum, both by politicians and the press, which is not actually true at all. The scale of the problem and its supposedly unprecedented nature is colossally exaggerated, and to that extent, I would say it's akin to a bit of a moral panic in some ways, which is obviously something that Granville, you'll know I've likened some of these periods to before in Scroungers, for example. But yeah, so obviously I've been very close to these policy announcements because I've been working on this book in the last few months, coinciding with this period, but also the focus of the book is the discourses around economic activity, and that's what the policies are about. I think that figure, I don't know, the figures do seem to change, but I've seen that 7 billion more and more in the last couple of weeks as well. As I understand it, I think that is on the back more of the Chancellor's statement that was made a week or so after the Green Paper was published by Liz Kendall. So the Pathways to Work Green Paper was published, and that was the one that outlined in the end, as you say, after months and months of drip feed, testing the waters with public opinion by kite flying, as we call it, more and less extreme versions of what the government were planning in the media to see how it fell with public opinion or whatever. When it was finally announced in the Green Paper, initially by Liz Kendall, it was around about the 5 billion, I think, that she was at, which was, depending again on which figure you took from what the Tories had been planning, was either even more than they'd been planning, because some figures attached to the Tories were 3 billion in the short term. But I think in the longer term, the Tories have been talking about up to 12 billion within the next few years per year, which is obviously a huge cut. So she ended up, Liz Kendall, announcing stuff that was sort of in between at 5 billion-ish. But within a week, Rachel Reeves had come along with the sort of spring statement, the delayed spring statement, or whatever it was called, this non-fiscal event, which was actually quite big again in the end. And it had increased. It had increased. She'd come back for more money by all accounts. And I think the figure broadly put on that by a lot of people, mainly people, was nearer to 7 billion. You're right. But I mean, in terms of the detail of the policy, as Rachel rightly says, not everyone claiming a disability-related benefits are in poverty, because PIP, for example, is not means tested. You could get it theoretically to help you with the day-to-day living costs if you were rolling in money. In reality, that isn't the case for the vast bulk of people who do claim PIP. That a significant proportion of those people are also on out of work disability-related benefits, but notionally and in principle is available to anyone, as disability living allowance used to be, to help with living costs irrespective of their income. But I think the other thing to say about an unintended consequence, to give the government the benefit of the doubt for a second, of the announcements, is that making the scale of cuts they're proposing to PIP, and they're going for PIP because it's the one that costs the most money, they're framing it as about tackling economic inactivity, even though PIP is no corollary of economic inactivity at all, because you might be in work and claiming PIP, and also you might be way above a threshold for being able to claim out of work related benefits at all and still eligible for PIP because of disability. So the government's justification for the PIP cuts, as with the whole package, is to try to address economic inactivity, people who are out of work and not looking for work because of disability or any other factors. But the reality is the main pot of money they're going for, because it's the most money, it's the most expensive of the benefits, so that's where they can make the biggest savings, is PIP, which is not related directly to economic inactivity at all, and in fact could well have the unintended consequence of putting more people off work, driving more people out of work who are currently in it, but relying on the PIP in order to be able to go to work. I don't know whether Rachel wanted to jump in on it.
Yeah, well, Rachel, do you want to add any comments on this, on what you think of the policy proposals and some of the controversies generated around them?
I think if you're looking, I was just looking at earlier today, obviously, at how some of these policies are being reported. And my fascination, my interest in journalism is in something called the political unconscious. So it's this idea that journalists aren't necessarily, they don't sit there thinking, oh, I'm going to write awful things about people in poverty and people with disabilities now. Some do, obviously, But for the most part, it's socialized. It becomes habitual. There is words that become used over and over again, and habits of working. So, for example, crackdown has become the word that's used, you know, which suggests it has to be done. There's a crackdown, and this is a problem that needs to be solved. And benefit cheats, the focus on benefit cheats becomes the norm. So journalists, there's so many stories about benefit cheats, and increasingly now there's suggestion, as I said earlier, about PIP, even though there aren't any people cheating PIP. But it becomes socialized. It becomes something that's in the office. It becomes something that if you write it in a particular way, you'll get it past the editor, rather than this idea that you know that there's a desire to persecute people. And there's also the habit of reporting as if you're talking to people who aren't in receipt of benefits, who've never been in receipt of benefits, who aren't on PIP. So that works to other people who are. So we're all over here talking about this in media discourse, but the people we're talking about are over there, and they're not reading our papers, they're not watching the news. And that, again, I think it adds to the stigma and to the sort of the dehumanizing. So my interest is in less in the overt, obvious you know, discourse that you might see in The Sun, and the habitual stuff that you're just as likely to see in The Guardian.
Yeah, and I
Thanks.
think. Sorry, Granville.
Yeah, come in, James.
Sorry. No, I was just going to pick up slightly on that. I completely agree, and I think again this partly comes out of maybe the two of us having been journalists at one point as well. There's so much of what you end up doing. Partly it's due to the sheer speed and the pressures of the job. Just as academics would put it, there are things that you end up doing normatively. There are automatic kind of ritualized things that you end up doing, and turns of phrase, off the shelf turns of phrase, without even thinking, that you just recycle all of the time. And there's also, again, going back to the point I was making about some of the supposed facts about the current scale of economic inactivity and how unprecedented it is, that are endlessly repeated by politicians right across the piece. And indeed by some sort of think tanks and research institutes and so on, because some of that stuff, out of a combination of lack of resources in newsrooms, but also a slight laziness, I think, among journalists at times, isn't properly queried or investigated or anything like that. Cycled as an accepted truth, as a truism, even though actually it isn't exactly right. It's not a million miles away. There is some truth to it. We do have at the moment more economically inactive people, however you define them. It's a horrible term, but however you define them, in one way or another, we do have more than we have had at other periods, but it isn't the highest level we've ever had, proportionately or in any other way. In 1983, we had something like 25% of working-aged adults were, nearly 26%, that was the peak year, were economically inactive in one way or another at the height of the deindustrialization period, if you like. Today, it's 21.6% or something. So actually, it's significantly, and we had a much smaller population then too, so it isn't an unprecedented level. It isn't the highest rate we've ever had. It isn't higher than all the other G7 countries proportionately either. Italy, France, and the US have got higher rates of economic inactivity than us. But you wouldn't know it from the coverage because it's just these lazy one-liners that are endlessly recycled, often quite high up in the story, because they're kind of justifying the angle of the story. Even if the story is told in a fairly balanced way as a news story, those kinds of lines are repeated as the sort of backup, as part of the angle as to why the government's launching this, as Rachel put it, crackdown at the moment, and so anyone reading it who's not an expert, and that's fair enough, I mean, people are busy in that, is just going to keep imbibing these kind of sweeping statements that are really unsubstantiated by the evidence in many cases.
Okay, thanks, James. I've got what topical question here that fits in with what we're just talking about. This is from Maya, RH. People in poverty on benefits and the disabled have voiced in groups they're worried to say anything to journalists or those in the media, as it's likely to get twisted. Is there a way we could get our voices out without that happening? So maybe Rachel first and then James to come in.
Well, when I was doing, it's a perfectly fair point. It's an important point. And so when I was doing the initial guide with people, that was one of the things that they said. We don't want to talk to journalists. We don't know what they're going to say, and we don't know how they're going to twist our stories. So the organisation I was working with, as I said, was Church Action on Poverty. And they and a number of other organisations now have sort of media units where they'll train people on how to deal with journalists, but also will say to the journalist, we want to know what the story is before you write it. Journalists will often say, well, we don't know. That's not really true. They often do know exactly what they want, the angle that they're going to take. They will say, what photograph are you going to take of me? I don't want you taking a picture of me by the bins because that somehow represents poverty, So it kind of empowers people to be able to say to journalists, I know what it is that you want to achieve, so why don't we work together? Tell me what it is that you want. And again, my interest is in getting journalists to recognise that people in poverty are knowledgeable. They're really good sources, rather than, you can go and ask an MP, and MPs will be quoted in great detail about their take on policy or their take on poverty. They don't necessarily know as much, but because they're an MP, they get, they will be quoted at length. And so it's a mixture of recognising people in poverty, getting journalists to recognise that people in poverty are knowledgeable and valuable sources. Journalists want good sources, they want people to speak to. And then also providing people who want to speak to the media the opportunities to understand how it's done and the power to be able to chat to have some control over the narrative, how they're being written about, or the interview that takes place, I think.
James, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I mean, I completely agree with Rachel. I mean, Rachel's done a lot in recent times, I think. I mean, not just through working with people on the reporting poverty guidelines, but I think more recently in making some really strong arguments for not just treating people with the lived experience quite rightly as the experts. Ultimately they're the main experts, aren't they? They're the real experts, but also just making sure that the journalist does everything possible to actually get their voices directly into the journalism. Although I completely understand, by the way, going back to the questioner, why there is a reticence about that, why there is a great reluctance and a concern and an anxiety about engaging with journalists, because people in the past, not just people in poverty, but other groups, have been very seriously burned. Asylum seekers, immigrants, migrants of one kind or another have been heavily burned by giving interviews to, say, the Daily Mail, and then being completely turned over with a nice photo in front of the council house they've got or whatever, So it's completely understandable why there's that reticence, but it really is important, I think, and again, coming at it from the journalistic angle, that journalists try to build that trust that they can engage directly with, first of all, recognize that the expertise lies with those people, but then persuade those people to engage with them, and then not betray that trust when it's given to them. It's hugely important, and I think those reporting poverty guidelines are a good way, a very good starting point for trying to make sure that it's done in the right way, and that the trust isn't betrayed, and what ends up getting published is genuinely reflective of the conversations. I mean, a trend in academia, actually academic research around these sorts of issues historically has tended to be quite critical of the articles that have focused on individuals when they've been talking about welfare, social security, poverty, etc. But that's as with immigration, partly because when you look that tend to focus a lot on so-called human interests like the Daily Mail and the Express, the way they do it is to turn over those people and misrepresent them, having carried out interviews and so on, and to portray or to focus on really extreme cases of genuine benefit fraud and portray that as somehow endemic and reflective of everyone who's on benefits. So there's quite rightly been a strong academic and wider social critique of that kind of approach to focusing articles on individuals, but really there are other ways of focusing articles on, or bringing in the voices of individuals with the lived experience of families and households and communities, and being more accurate and representative in the way it's done as a counterweight to that. And we haven't seen enough effort done historically on actually genuinely trying to do that. And so Rachel's 100% right with that. And one other thing I just wanted to say was that I think, Rachel, am I right in thinking that On Road Media worked with you on some of what you did way back as well? Is that not right?
I don't know.
Heard they're called Heard now, that charity.
Yeah,
that's me misremembering. I know. Yeah,
he's on something else, but not on this. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. There's a charity that was called On Road Media. I just wanted to give a shout out to that charity. They're called Heard now. And there's also ATD Fourth World, who do fantastic work, anti-poverty charity. Both of those two charities I owe a huge amount to at the moment, because they've helped me personally, putting me in touch, not for the purposes of journalism, but for the book I'm currently working on, and a project I'm currently working on. They put me in touch with people with lived experiences, and just in terms of getting those people's voices into the academic research, let alone into journalism, it's been so eye-opening. And the book, when it finally comes out, it just wouldn't be, I'm not saying it's going to be a great book or whatever I'd like it to be, but it would be nowhere near as good and nowhere near as truthful without those experiences, those direct expert experiences in there. So there are charities as well working, and Heard particularly focuses on trying to give media training to people from disadvantaged groups as well, not just people in poverty, but other groups too, including migrants and asylum seekers. And I think that work is hugely important as part of this jigsaw of how we get that lived experience out there and more widely recognised.
Okay, thanks. There's lots of questions coming in now. There's one, just this is one I think might be worth looking at. Just as a background, because you mentioned academic research in the areas of disability, poverty, and so on. This is from Jacob Lewis. Why has the demonization narrative of disability, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, persisted since the Elizabethan Poor Laws of undeserving and undeserving poor? I mean, just in recollection, I remember Peter Golding's done quite a lot of work on this, hasn't he, as well as others. So can we just tackle that one? Why is the narrative, that division, that dichotomy, the deserving and undeserving poor?
Well, I've just published a book that looked at the political unconscious. It looks at how journalism reported on poverty during the cotton crisis. So we had workers who, through no fault of their own, were put out of work because the cotton mills had closed down for a whole variety of reasons. And again, the reporting wasn't necessarily just openly condemning people in poverty. It was showing a fear of people in poverty. So when there were demonstrations, the stories often ended with, and they dispersed quietly, to reassure the middle classes reading the publications that there was nothing to worry about, there wasn't any political uprising. Or they talk about, there'd be some moral judgment about the clothes that they were wearing. So these were people who had been considered, they were amongst the best paid among the working class at the time. They were considered the beginnings of sort of working class aspiration, because they had little libraries and musical instruments, so there were all these things going on that would suggest they should be accepted, they should be deserving. But the moment they lost work, the moment they were in need of what was called famine relief, despite it not being a famine, they were then presented as undeserving. So this deserving undeserving thing can be quite misguided, in that I found it myself. The moment I've had to go and sign on, I was undeserving the minute I went to the job centre. The day before I wasn't, the day I signed on I was. But then even back then as well, there were also sanctions. So there were reasons then to justify this contempt for people in poverty. So there's one guy I read about, Thomas Grimes in Manchester, who needed relief along with all the other workers that were put out of work. Thomas had one arm, but he was forced to do a labour test to prove that he was entitled to relief. And then, even more depressingly, he missed a visit to see one of the poor relief governors when his wife was dying, and money was taken from him. So he should have got 7 shillings, and he was given 3 shillings. And this is back in 1862, you know. And there was another guy who was threatened with the withdrawal of his benefits because he'd organised anti-poverty protests. So it isn't new, you know, it isn't new. And I'm not saying the answer is, you know, only speaking to people in poverty, but I think that the fundamental thing that I sort of cling to is that only then really can we start, I think, to unpick this demonizing, you know, the casual demonizing, the casual assumptions about people in poverty that become the norm. So the newspapers I analysed in the in reporting on the cotton crisis were the Guardian, the early Manchester Guardian, which was a liberal paper, a radical paper called the Manchester Times, and then a conservative paper called the Manchester Courier. They all reported very, very similarly. You know, it wasn't a political thing. It was very much a, you know, a defence of the status quo, a defence of the capitalist system. And it's been something, you know, as the person asked the question, has been going on for over a century.
James, do you want to
Yeah,
come in?
I would say,
Thanks.
I mean, in as Granville, as you know, in Scroungers, I sort of go way back in history at one point, so I do. And I hate to say it, there's a chapter in the new book that I'm working on with this particular focus around economic activity. So disability is obviously a particularly big part of it, and historical conceptions and representations of disability. There's another chapter that's very historical in this book. And yeah, back in the Elizabethan era and the actually earlier medieval period, they were talking about sturdy beggars and false mendicants and things like that, and terrible panic, you know, centuries long panics about beggars, you know, that seem to be way out of kilter with what we now know from analysis of historical records, the probable scale of all of that was. And obviously some people were war wounded who ended up coming back, you know, with no home and no income and no welfare state to help them out and so on, and you know, and ended up having to beg for that reason. But then there were kind of internal divisions within the disabled. You know, war wounded at times were seen as relatively more deserving because they'd been fighting for king and country or whatever, and other people who were, you know, people disputed whether they were genuinely disabled or not. These discourses, as you say, go back centuries, you know. And I think just to that point about why is it that we do it? Why is it that society do it? How does it manage to take hold and why? There's 2 things that strike me. I mean, one of which I went into a lot in Scroungers, and I think I'm kind of trying to wrestle with this again in the new book particularly around disability. And one of them is a really simple point, I think. It's easier to demonize, it's easier to blame, it's easier to convince yourself or kind of salve your conscience or whatever with the belief that people are responsible for their own poverty. It's their own fault because they made the wrong choices, they've got behavioral defects, they didn't try hard enough, they're lazy or whatever. You know, that's easier than feeling at least partly, just a little bit, socially responsible as part of a wider society and community, you know, and recognizing that there are often structural issues why people end up losing their jobs en masse. Going back to Rachel's example, and there are often, you know, any number of other sort of economic factors that contribute to periods of rising economic activity, and of course all sorts of other pressures we've had in recent years that have led to the sort of mental health epidemic we to some extent genuinely do have at the moment, you know. So it's just an easier thing to do to not have to feel guilty or responsible in any way about anyone, and to just statistic belief that it's those individuals' faults, and if they really wanted to get out of it, or if they tried hard enough to get out of it, they could do. And I think the other thing I wanted to say that I think I'll probably go on about this more in that book is just it's the scapegoating thing, isn't it? So the elite directed narratives, the ones that come from the politicians of the day, the powers that be of the day, and the elite media and all of that kind of thing. They kind of construct this idea, particularly the politicians who are in power, governments and so on, that there are big socioeconomic problems going on. Some of the economic problems are down to their own economic mismanagement, among other things, quite often. But it's easier, rather than the gaze of the wider population of voters pointing towards them and accusing them, the powers that be, of making mistakes and or making the wrong decisions or whatever. It's much easier for them and their kind of acolytes in the current context in which we're in the right-wing press and so on, to point the finger at a vulnerable group somewhere over there, and to to suggest or to state more explicitly that somehow they're the ones who are responsible. Those groups are responsible. It's those people over there. This happens, of course, with immigrants, with asylum seekers, with all those other groups we talked about. But it very much happens, and has happened repeatedly in recent times, with working age benefit recipients. Particularly people out of work in one way or another. And I think also at times like the ongoing cost of living crisis, when you've got working people who are at all levels of the political spectrum, but of the income spectrum, but particularly at the bottom, people on relatively low and very modest incomes who are working really hard, struggling, still can barely put food on the table and so on. Rather than, as you should be, doing everything possible to try to address the position they're in, and including through the social security system, including through the benefit system, by being more generous there and putting up the minimum wage properly before as soon as you can and so forth. It's very, very easy to not do that, because that all costs money anyway, and to simply distract attention by pointing the finger of blame at the people who are out of work, who are also desperately struggling, so that you get those people fighting amongst themselves and blaming each other, rather than joining forces, as it were, and looking in the direction of where the blame really is, if you like. And I think post-financial crash, just before that coalition government came in, and we had very, very poisonous discourses around the benefit system during that period. We all know that a big part of why all of us ended up in that situation after the financial crash was because of the mismanagement of the banking system and the lack of regulation and so on. But again, very rapidly, the finger of blame wasn't any longer pointing towards the bankers and everything, and people who've subsequently gone on to do very well again, but pointing towards the vulnerable groups in society. And the conversation was turning to the fact that they apparently costed us too much money because the social security system is too expensive. And actually they were the main reason we were in that situation, not the collapse of the financial system.
It's also very much treating working class people as cattle. Again, during the cotton crisis, what they needed at the time was for people to move to Australia, to New Zealand, to other places where they could set up and develop the empire and grow more cotton in other places. And so the part of the blame, part of the stigmatizing then of working class people, was intended to get them to agree to leave. That was part of, that was how they could give back, and that was how they could show that they had they were thinking of the future and they were contributing. So it's political, and it finds its way, for all the reasons we've discussed, into the discourse in the newspapers, and that it's something that has been going on for centuries.
On that point, I think that's that you just triggered me there. Rachel was in more ways than one. No, I'm joking. You triggered me with you just reminded me to say something about from the newspaper end of it, because I was focusing very much on the way that the politicians particularly try to manipulate the narratives and frame things, But you're dead wrong. I mean, I think with the press particularly and the commercial media, it's a lot of this is down to pounds and pence. A lot of this is commercially driven. As we know, just forget about poverty and the benefit system for a second. Division and discord on social media, for example, we know that there are people in Silicon Valley, for example, doing very well financially out of stoking that. Engaging, inverted commas, and enraging people by pitting this group against that and getting fights, and those sorts of, and those kind of, as I would say, sort of moral panic type discourses that are way out of proportion with the scale of an actual problem presented by a group in society or whatever. They play very well commercially for these organizations, because the more hits, the more shares, the more likes they have, the longer people hang around on their websites and so on, the more they're selling advertising on the back of it, the more money they make.
I think we've explored that topic. I just want to mention there's a point here made by Tom Griffiths, so I think I need to respond to this. It says, despite your shared emphasis on the value of people with lived experience as the experts on poverty, it's noticeable that the debate at this festival is led by two people in well-paid academic positions and not by experts themselves. Is this a fair comment? Well, first of all, Tom, it's a good point, but I did make, as when I put the proposal to have this event in the Festival of Debate, I made strenuous efforts to get a third member of the panel, at least a disability activist, without success. And I did talk with Rachel and James about this and said, should we go ahead? And we agreed that we had enough material to do it. But I think that's a very fair point to make. All I can say is that I've found it unusually difficult. Normally it's quite easy, but I think because of the situation we're in, I think a lot of people are busy doing the things that they want to do in terms of their disability activity. I mean, I was at a meeting the other week, and a guy travelled about 30, 40 miles to just give out leaflets about disabled people against the cuts, Crips Against the Cuts, an organisation. And I think they're active in it. But I take your point, Tom. I don't know whether James or Rachel want to comment about being highly paid. I know that academic life might be moderately well paid, but that's a comparison. I don't. So anyway,
it's relative, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to cry poverty. But I think that's absolutely a fair point. I would say that any research I do now, I do it in a participatory way. So it's done. I'm about to embark on some research with ACD Fourth World about epistemic injustice in journalism, and how do we get journalists to understand and to recognise that people in poverty are valuable sources and people that you should be speaking to. And that will be entirely participatory. It'll be equal. Everybody's names will go on the projects. So wherever possible. That's how I try to work, but I mean, I agree entirely that there should always be somebody able to speak who isn't necessarily doing it from an academic position.
Yeah, and I completely agree with all of that too. I mean, again, and probably in a slightly different way to Rachel, but the research that I do now, as with the book that I'm working on at the moment, where I've done, I've spoken to a lot of people from all around the UK with the help of ATD Fourth World and the other charity Herd, who have direct lived experience. I try now increasingly when I do have a chance to talk directly to and involve directly people with lived experience in my research, not to just have that old style social explorer approach with like a clipboard and metaphorically speaking, and set questions, and it's very extractive. It's very much I'm the interviewer, you're the interviewee. I try as much as I possibly can to make it much more like a conversation. I also always invite these the people that I engage with to contribute in other ways if they like, if they would like to, either through writing something down for me if at some point when they have time, if they would like to do that, or even they could do it in video form and other forms, or visually through art or whatever. In fact, one of the people that I've engaged with for the book I'm working on at the moment is an artist, at least partly, and has done that, which is lovely. I'm still trying to work out whether there's a way that we can get that into the book ideally, but yeah, it's imperfect, all of this, and ideally today, I think tonight, as Granville says, we all would have liked to have had someone more directly who's in that situation now. I mean, the only other thing I would add is that, like Rachel, I've been unemployed. I've had periods like that, and I had quite a long period at one point way back. And also, I did grow up in a household where that my father was unemployed for a number of years. I think he'd be okay for me to mention that, because I mentioned it in the forward anyway to Scroungers, I think, a few years ago. But without going into any details, obviously that was many years ago, but it was a very difficult time, and I do, as a child, as a, you know, a teenager particularly, and into going to university, we had no money in the house for many years. So it's a long time ago. I'm in a very privileged position now. It's completely different, you know, but there is lived experience there. I think that's partly reformed some of my research interests in some ways.
I was about to say that's what informs it. I mean, because you can, you know, obviously you could research anything you want to, but I want to research this because I think it matters.
Right. Okay. There was another comment made by, I can't find it now, but another person was making a similar point. Why aren't we hearing from the organisations that are active around this issue? So if there is anybody out there who's in the audience, please do highlight it, and we can try and give you a chance to speak. I just want to, we're going to move towards a session on what we can do in a minute or two, but I just wanted to just step back a bit. When I was doing some reading around this topic for the event, I came across the book by Steph Benstead. It was called Second Class Citizens, The Treatment of Disabled People in Austerity Britain. And it examined the real life experience of disabled people and the impact of austerity on welfare reforms under the Tories and the Lib Dem coalition, we have to remember. I've heard this package that's been put forward by this government as austerity dressed as reform. And Labour's package, we've already questioned whether the amount is 5 billion or more, but are there any difference between the priorities of the two governments? That's over to both of you on that one. Who wants to go first? Rachel?
I can't see a difference. It's neoliberal politics. It's in fact, looking at it, sometimes you see news stories and I forget that Labour are in power. I don't think there's a wafer thin gap between them, if any gap at all.
I mean, I think I'm depressingly feeling by the day exactly the same. I mean, I think Liz Kendall slightly the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact she's very much from the right of the Labour Party and things. That's been known for a long time. But I kind of gave her the benefit of that for a little while, because I got the impression I was hearing from some charities that I was working with, you know, in early stages of researching the book, that she did seem to be actually directly keen to engage with people. And obviously she represents a Leicester constituency. There's very high levels of poverty and economic inactivity as well. But and I don't think her rhetoric, at least overtly, going back to some of what Rachel was talking about earlier, it being a bit more subtle and insidious these days, perhaps not as blatant. I don't think her rhetoric, certainly early on, was anywhere near as bad as we'd had under the coalition. I mean, to the extent that it was almost protested too much, she was very overtly, repeatedly coming out and saying that she wanted to move away from discourses of scroungers and shirkers and so on. But the problem is, first of all, the rhetoric now has got worse, even if it's slightly more disguised. You know, people taking the mickey and gaming the system, and all of these phrases are wheeled out all the time by ministers in a Labour government. And so the insinuations are still quite similar, aren't they? But also, it's not just Liz Kendall, it's particularly Starmer and Rachel Reeves, I think. You know, they're clearly, at the moment at least, driving the ship. And there's this obsession with this fiscal straitjacket. And so getting back to the point, the actual point, I suppose, Granville, in terms of policy and you know, whatever the rhetoric is, you know, what is it that this government's actually trying to do, regardless of what it says it's trying to do, which is to repair a broken social security system and support more people who want to work into work and so on. It's clearly primarily driven by an obsession with saving money from what on paper in simple terms is one of the biggest pots of money that's spent every year, as quickly as possible, because of self-imposed fiscal rules are completely unnecessary and will forever prevent this Labour government doing anything that it considers to be progressive that it's actually trying to do, which obviously in this area it's not at all. It's regressive, if anything, you know. So if it was really serious about reforming the social security system to help people who are economically inactive, to use that term, back into work, or more of them back into work, it would put all of the support in place properly, really high quality support, including a massive injection into mental health, particularly up front, which would cost vastly more for a few more years, at least, or significantly more than we're currently spending, but would repay to some extent, probably in the medium to longer term. But it isn't serious about that, despite what it claims it's trying to do, because really what it wants to do is save as much money as quickly as possible. And that basically is austerity again, isn't it? It's a self-imposed fiscal straitjacket, an obsession with balancing the books, even though it isn't quite, it's never going to balance the books, and at the expense of a huge number of really vulnerable people.
Exactly that it is at the expense of that then comes the demonising, then comes the justification,
and then comes
and around
even
disabled people specifically.
Exactly. Even though we're not directly saying scroungers and shirkers, we're saying everything but, and we're quite happy for other people to do that dirty work for us to help justify
hinting at fraud, people on PIP are fraudsters, and this language of crackdown. You know, it is austerity too, and it demands the same demonisation.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to take one more question from the participants have sent in. This is from Lily Buonasorte. I hope I've got that correct. I'm wondering if this moral panic of an emphasis on fraud provides apt cushioning for the 2024 Public Authorities Bill. I don't understand, which will give the DWP direct access to claimants' bank accounts, search homes with warrants. Do either of you have any thoughts on this? I'm just not clear about that. Did she mean the 2025 Public Authorities Bill? Can you clarify that?
I believe James might correct me. I believe it was started by the Tories. This giving the DWP the authority if they suspect. I don't think even if just if they suspect fraud, but you know, access to your bank accounts and searching your home. And yeah, I think the emphasis on that level of fraud it has to follow with this form of demonisation again to justify it, because otherwise, you know, there is a concern that neighbours might be outraged that people are being spied on and that their bank accounts are being looked at. So you have to find a way ideologically to justify it happening.
I mean, they claim again, there's this sort of forked tongue thing, isn't it? Because with the fraud thing, they're claiming that they're primarily after sort of industrial scale fraud. I mean, there's a tiny number of cases like this every year, and it's still a drop in the ocean compared to tax fraud and everything anyway, as we all know, which is 10 times at least as great by any measure. But they claim that the main driver is to try and crack down on kind of criminal levels of fraud by people who are not, you know, in most cases don't have any disabilities, don't, you know, and are probably living the life of Riley somewhere and have never needed to claim benefits or whatever. And particularly, I think during the COVID period, they claimed that there was a lot of fraud that was able to take place when temporarily things got a little bit generous and some of the checks and balances weren't as great or whatever. But the fact that it's happening, yes, it was introduced by the Conservatives originally, but it's been doubled down on, and very much so rhetorically by Keir Starmer repeatedly recently. And the fact that this is happening in tandem with everything else that's happening been announced around benefits, even though, you know, they aren't suggesting that all of the fraud is down to economically inactive people or disabled people or people who say they're disabled or whatever. There's a very deliberate kind of coincidence of the amount of government attention that's being placed on those two twin-pronged approaches to slashing the welfare bill, as it were, at the same time, and so they well know that it creates the impression, and it doubles down on the impression that they're trying to create of wide-scale abuse of the system of one kind or another, whether it's down to fraud or people who really should be doing more to finding work, and yeah, as Rachel said, the narratives, the government's direct ones, but the ones of the supported areas of the press and so on, are the thing that they roll the pitch, so to speak, don't they, these days? But that they build the consensus, they build the popular support, or they're designed to do that at the very least, for what the government's already decided it's going to do, which is pretty brutal.
Okay. Thanks for that, James. There was one long comment in the questions. I'm not sure whether how to respond to this. It's of Anne Galpin, and it's at Sarah Hill, and she's actually making a statement about and understanding the difference between disabled people's organisations run by and for disabled people, such as Disability Rights, Disabled People Against Cuts, Inclusion London, Disability Wales, Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, versus charities.
Yeah.
Nothing about us without us. There are also brilliant books by disabled people on this topic: The Department by John Pring and The War on Disabled People by Ellen Clifford. I'm not sure if there's any you want to respond to. I just thought it was worth reading that one out if people hadn't seen it. I'm not sure you want to respond to in that, Rachel or James. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Just agreeing. I think nothing without.
Yeah,
nothing
I agree
is
too. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to move. We're getting towards the final 15 minutes. We've looked at the problems. We've looked at the way the media covers the issues. What can we do now? I saw today in Labour Outlook, Andy MacDonald, a North East MP, he put a very powerful statement about why he's going to vote against this package. I've never seen so much anger, to be honest, in an MP. And I saw a discussion yesterday about another group of MPs where one of the MPs said, "I will swim through vomit to vote against this package."
So
we have, I said there was a very strong sense of opposition building against this whole package of cuts. So what do we do? What sorts of things? I mean, if I might just chip in, I'm just reading from this leaflet, Disabled People Against the Cuts, a call to action. We need you to write to your MP and let them know you don't agree with these plans. But let's have a final session. What sorts of things can we do to build, if you want, the opposition and to see whether the package that we've been discussing about can be defeated, which would be, or rather to get the majority of Labour MPs to vote against it, which would be a tremendous achievement.
I left the Labour
James?
Party a very long time
Rachel,
ago. Sorry, just saying, I left the Labour Party a very, very long time ago. And my MP's Ian Byrne, and I like him very much, and I admire his anti-poverty activism. And I think he was quoting John McDonnell about swimming through sick. But I had, and he had the whip taken off him for voting against Starmer and what have you. But I mean, I wonder if the Labour Party in that sense is actually a bit of a lost cause. So I find the question very, very difficult.
Right.
Answer.
Okay.
I mean,
James?
the thing that, as we know, the thing that will get
frozen.
That's frozen quite a long frozen,
to move on anything is fear of losing their seats, fear of losing, So even if they don't, as one would hope they would, have a principled objection, to the government policies that have been proposed, which, you know, we would hope as many of them did as possible, even if in other ways they were enthusiastic for some reason about Starmer or they wanted to be loyal. You would think that many of them would be uncomfortable at least. But even if they're not, and even if they think there's, despite last week's local elections, sitting on safe enough majorities to the extent that that's a thing anymore, what will move people normally, and, you know, and to some extent, even in very small ways, was the case with some Conservative MPs even in the past, and Lib Dems and so on, is if they fear that last week isn't an aberration, and even though we're less than a year into this government, that the way things are going, if they don't start making a stand at some point over things like this, which should be fundamental to the Labour Party to stand against, that, you know, that they have to do so, because just even if only out of enlightened self-interest, they're in trouble if they don't, you know. So I think really convoluted answer. I mean, there isn't really an answer, but I think sign every petition. When there are marches, go on the marches, protest, you know, make them feel uncomfortable, really shout about it and make it clear that it's an issue that a huge number of people in the country really care about. You know, if there are that many people who are, inverted commas, economically inactive, and there are a lot of people who are, whether you like that term or not, even though it is, there's sort of 6 degrees of separation here. You know, an awful lot of us, directly or indirectly, know someone who is in this position, who's potentially a target of these policies, and particularly in the mental health sense, I think, these days, but just generally. And we need to listen to what they're saying. We listen to their concerns, listen to their lived experiences, think about it, think about what we know in some cases about people's lived experiences because we're related to them or we know them, and project that across all the other people potentially affected by this, and make a massive fuss about it. Treat it as a real cause célèbre, like other things that we do occasionally campaign en masse about, you know. But I suppose that's all we can do, and vote for other parties when we come to elections if they can insist on sticking to this cause, or don't vote at all. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying that, but it depends where you live and what position you're in and what the choices are. But, you know, certainly I would vote elsewhere at the moment, you know.
I think just for me to be a little bit more positive, because I do just go, oh, when I feel quite defeated by the Labour Party. But you know, James in his book does acknowledge that there is a change. So the fact that the newspapers no longer think they can get away, we talk about strivers and skivers and poverty lifestyles and people are lying in bed while you're going to work, does show that fight back changes things. And yes, they're going to be a bit more subtle about it, but I think they are aware, as we said at the start, they are aware that people are angered by these particular cuts. I think there is an opportunity by stepping up that anger and protest that you can potentially, you know, confront it and achieve something.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think just as an extension on it, you're dead right, actually, Rachel. I was being very negative there and getting more and more heated, but more and more indignant. But I think we can make a virtue of the fact that the old style, you know, mass media gatekeepery environment doesn't exist anymore. We have social media. Not everyone has access to it. Not everyone, some of the people we're talking about in poverty actually don't have decent internet connections, let alone smartphones and stuff. But enough people do, and enough people who are connected, enough people who care do, and enough people with lived experience, particularly in PIP, where it isn't related necessarily to poverty or not being in work anyway. People do have a voice in ways that you know, more people do in ways that wasn't the case in the past, where you had to rely on fighting your way into the print press or whatever, and the vast majority of the market wouldn't care, wouldn't let you in. You know, it's not like that now. We can get the stories out there, the voices, the lived experience of the experts by experience. And it's our duty as academics and journalists doing their job properly, it's their duty to facilitate that as much as possible.
Well, on that note, then I think that might be where we've got a few minutes left, but I just want to make a couple of points, and then maybe we can wind up. First of all, the Festival of Debate, when they first invited us to put this proposal in, it would have been about 8 months ago. Well, certainly last October, November time, I think it was. And since then, I think this issue has moved from the margins to the foreground. It's been at the centre. And that's one of the things that I think has made it a very timely event to hold and to explore some of these issues. I do urge that you should, anybody that's been participated in the meeting, that you should be seeking any way you can to seek to get this package of reforms opposed. It seems to me that the points you're making, James, about using social media, whatever, but it does seem to me as well that a number of the organisations, I saw a report in The Guardian today about a number of disability groups who are now focusing on the final run of action and campaign, because the vote is a month away. And I think that gives people enough time to make sure they do, whether it's voting for MPs. I note, by the way, in the Q&A, somebody at the end, it's Maya RH says, "It's worrying as my MP is proudly disabled and talks about it, but has implied her vote with Starmer about the cuts." So quite disappointing. And then there's another one, she's to comment from her. Isn't it that similar to what happened to Zara Sultana when she spoke out and became independent? So there are risks. I don't know what it would depend on the scale of the rebellion by the Labour, but the notion that they can do what they did before and suspend 50 or 60 MPs because they vote against it, I don't think that would be realistic. So I do encourage people to spend the next few weeks before that vote trying to solidify the opposition to the package of cuts that's being proposed, because I do think, and I echo the points that two speakers have made, that it is austerity, just like in the same way as was done by Cameron and Osborne. I did read today, and I'll finish with this, a very strong piece by the leader of Unite, in which he made this very simple point that if we were to tax the rich, and this is the problem, we're tackling and seeking to make a solution by piecemeal, tiny cuts, which will damage and hurt disabled people enormously, when we could very simply look to a tax on wealth which would not damage anybody at all. And I think that would be the message I would want to end this meeting on. So thanks very much, James and Rachel, for taking part in the event. And I hope I found it very interesting. And I hope you have found it useful and valuable too. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.